Welcome to the Love, Sex, and Leadership podcast, where you can discover simple tantric teachings to embody your true power, awaken your soul's wisdom, and live an inspired life as a natural, intuitive, and heart-centered leader. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Love, Sex, and Leadership. Very excited to have a friend, Joshua Wenner, here with me. We knew each other actually from many years ago in the world of LA and self-development and transformational work, and kind of been following each other's journeys through the years, and had him as one of the speakers for the Integrated Masculine Symposium several years ago, kind of a COVID offshoot that helped people when they were in the comfort of their own home. And yeah, I know you just released a powerful documentary, and super excited to have you on board here for this conversation. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Really appreciate it, brother.
Yeah, and you're in Austin right now.
Austin, Texas. Yeah, I've been here about 2 years now and really enjoying it.
Oh, great. So I know one of the things that you really support people with is in the realms of what you're calling emotional resilience. And I do a lot of work with emotions and helping people navigate this human experience. But to you, what defines emotional resilience? Like that, what would you say to someone who doesn't really understand that concept?
Yeah, great question. So I look at our resilience is the ability to bounce back. Like how quickly can we bounce back? How elastic are we when something happens? Emotional resilience is emotionally how much flexibility do we have? And so oftentimes without the awareness of the nervous system, many people are majority of the day dysregulated and emotionally reactive and making choices and decisions from an emotional part of their brain or the survival part of their brain, which has decades of neurons that have fired together and wired together to replay out the same habitual patterns. And so when we can really master our emotional resilience, and that's why I even call it emotional resilience training, because it's continual repetition of the same fundamental frameworks. We really move into a place of thriving because we access a different part of our brain. So one, we can bounce back, we can stop. Has anybody ever said, hey, don't do X, don't eat the food, don't yell at my spouse, don't go to porn, don't eat don't take the nicotine, whatever, don't choose that reoccurring unhealthy partner, whatever it is, don't go back to an ex when they treat me like shit. Like there's something we say not to do. And then if you track it, you'll notice there's an emotional reaction. And in that time of emotional reaction, we do the things that don't always make logical sense or aren't always aligned with our values, and often creates internal shame. And so if we can develop high levels of emotional resilience, we actually become aware and conscious in those moments. It's not that we're taking over our emotions. We're just necessarily starting to move to a different part of the brain. We're moving from activated habitual reactionary to more of a regulated place where it's more responsive and we have choice. And so when we can live in that place, one, we see ourselves very differently in our relationship with our own selves because we're present. Two, we're able to spatially look at the environment and notice who's regulated or dysregulated. And so it removes us reacting to unfortunate circumstances in our environment, and we're able to lead those environments, lead our partners, lead our companies, lead the different environments in our lives because we're present, aware, conscious. So it's really that quickness of you being emotionally hijacked or actually having control over your, not because it's not control, it's more around awareness. And that part's not running the show anymore. You're in more of a thriving part of your life.
Yeah, great. Well, what I'm hearing and what you share is really the capacity to pause, to like notice that split second time when you're about to react from the habitual patterns that's been kind of overlaid and deeply embedded in the cells in the body, and being able to pause and make a change and a shift in the trajectory of life moving forward.
Correct. Yeah, it's even I have a framework that's called CPR, and it comes from, because I work with a lot of fire, police, military, and so I took the metaphor from when somebody's unconscious is typically when we would traditionally use CPR. And so when we recognize that our emotional habitual patterns are unconscious reactions, we're unconscious. So CPR stands for one, conscious awareness is the C. So being able to recognize what are our signs and symptoms that we're dysregulated or the environment's dysregulated. The P is pause. So you hit it right on the nose. We actually build in strategies around the pause. so that in certain habitual patterns where we react, we learn to go, oh, this is that happening. Here's my built-in pause, so that I can actually move into the R, which is then get regulated. And then once we're regulated, we get back into our body, we get back into our heart, and we can actually now solve those situations. So yeah, you're right on track with the P.
Beautiful. And doing this work, what percentage of humans do you think in this world are actually in their body?
I would say very little. I would say like, I mean, 99% of people, if I had to take or 90, if I'm looking at the global population, a
Hmm.
very small percentage, maybe
Hmm.
90% are not. If I had to give it broader, but most people are just not aware of their nervous system or the emotional reactions. Um,
Hmm.
and so majority of people listening to this are not going to have nervous system awareness. And if they do, I'll give one distinction. A lot of times people learn it to oh, in deep levels of emotional dysregulation, they go, oh, use the tool when I'm highly dysregulated. But what they don't realize, if you're not doing it every day, you're not aware majority of the time. And so you're much more
Hmm.
likely to get hijacked. So there's a very big difference between daily, I train to doing it multiple times a day, twice a day minimum. So when you're doing it every day, twice a day, you see the world very differently. And then you're usually like, oh, I couldn't see from where I was before. So even I've had people that I've trained that are like, oh, I know the language, I know how to regulate, but they just weren't doing them daily. They were still caught up by their emotions and letting it dictate their, even if they had awareness, they still weren't living at the place they could be living. So I'd say majority of people, and even those that are practicing, still get dysregulated on a regular
Hmm.
basis, but you can just come back to baseline much quicker and get back to your body a lot faster.
Mm. And to someone listening who's like, well, what do you even mean I'm not in my body? Like, of course I'm in my body. Like, how would you describe that like sensation and awareness? Because I see that a lot in their groups and their retreats, and it's like there's a certain moment that happens when people are like, I'm experiencing the world differently. But how, especially working with military and service individual people, and I come from a military world as well, but how do you even communicate that to people that there may not be in their body? Like that phrase, that understanding can almost get a little bit lost in perception in a way.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I like your angle on it. It's like most people are living from their heads and
Mm,
without the awareness that they're living from their heads. And so um the disconnect, because what grief and trauma, when you get into the world of grief and trauma, from my lens, everything stems from unprocessed grief, just because I have so much experience in the grief world. But oftentimes the trauma response is a disconnection from body, so that we don't feel safe in the body, we go to the head. And so and even women, I mean, I train a lot of women now, I train men, I train high performers, like I train so much. The same recurring pattern occurs where most of the time you can tell where you're living from, because are you usually thinking through problems, or are you usually feeling through problems? And
mm,
so often are you finding yourself, and that's why I train on the trauma signs, because it's a lot easier to recognize the sign than it is to even see yourself when you're in the head versus the body. But if I can see a sign, I can go, oh, there's a signal. It's like, I use a metaphor of like a truck. And when I'm training men, men like fast cars. So it's like, hey, imagine you're a high performance Lamborghini. And if you're a high performance Lamborghini, and the more stress you get, the more load. And most of men's work is learning how to carry more load, right? And so as we're taking on more load, the more responsibility you get, it only gets harder. So you need to build more emotional capacity to take on more. You're redlining. So imagine driving that vehicle fast. You're going down the street and you're burning at high red lines. But imagine if you're not filling up the tank with gas. So the way I use the nervous system framing is, imagine you're driving and you got a trip to go on, but then you run out of gas. What are you having to do? And that's an emotional reaction. Something throws you off. You're now in the head. You're now trying to figure out what I have to go do. You're emotionally reactive to a situation, a person, an event. It's ruminating consistently in the head. And when you're doing that, it's like you going, I ran out of gas. I now have to grab a gas can, go fill up the gas can, come back to my vehicle, do this whole work to get back on my trip again. So the gauges or the trauma signs are the things that start to pop up to go, oh, engine light's getting low, or gas lit gauge is getting low. And then you see the light and you go, I need to pull over and actually get some gas. It's still a pain in the ass, because regulation practices are not fun. They're not hard. They just take time and habitual patterns to create rituals around them. But when you're constantly putting gas, you can keep going the distance without running out of gas. So it's just an easy metaphor. If somebody's listening, how often do you get emotionally triggered by something in your day? And hey, let's say you set a strong goal for your health goals and then you eat the shitty food. Or let's say you set savings goals and then you blow past your spending limits and end up in debt again. Or you're wanting a healthy relationship and you say you won't let your partner treat you that way, and then you get run over, right? Because you emotionally got reacted, something happened, you went back to an old familiar pattern, which is a way of coping with that pain essentially. And then that took a big part of your day. So what would you be if you didn't have all these moments where you were emotionally triggered affecting your day on a regular basis? You'd have a lot more presence, you'd have a lot
Mhm.
more time and space in the body. And maybe to give another signal, when was the last time you really enjoyed a moment? Like
Mm.
there and like take in the sunset, feel the sun on your skin, feel the wind on your across your face. Like, are you able to feel the subtle sensations on your body? And are you appreciative and grateful for your body? And how often are you doing that? I find often the more stress we have, it's like, sunset, let me get back to task. Like we're so mission focused, especially men, that if we're so mission focused, there's no time to slow down. So we're constantly problem solving, we're constantly assessing situations and just running at that overdrive. So that may be a good question for somebody is, how easy is it for you to slow down?
Mm.
How often are you slowing down? And if you're saying, I don't have the time, you actually, when you start to regulate regularly, you don't change time, you're just present. So you're actually 10 times more effective. So you can still be emotionally effective getting things done, but actually is super aware of your body and the environment. So does that kind of ground it in a little bit for what
Yeah, absolutely. No, no, I love it, and in teaching and working a lot in somatic therapy and nervous system regulation, it's a joy to hear. Especially, I'm appreciating a lot of your analogies that are connecting the dots to men in like these very like sports stars and filling up the gas, and the very practical ways of assimilating and understanding how our nervous system is escalating and how we can actually learn to navigate it more gracefully. And I'm really appreciating it. Thank you.
What if I added one other piece when you talked about
Sure.
somatics? If you've talked a lot about somatics, to me, somatics are changing the oil. So if you
Mm,
think about the oil, if we don't change the oil, it becomes this dark, this really dark fluid. And if you actually don't ever change it, your engine will seize. So,
mhm,
so, so what happens when you change the oil is you're transmuting, you're releasing the dark sludge of oil that you've just used in this high combustion engine. You're releasing it and you're putting this golden new fluid to lubricate everything. And so when we look at what we're actually doing with somatics, it's the same thing. We're getting regulated to then go, oh, what's going on with my vehicle? Where do I need to transmute some of this dense energy that I'm actually feeling? And when I can get into the wounding, when you can move that through your body and actually move those through your body, you clean the tank.
mhm,
You've just changed your oil and your engine can run smoother again. So they're one and the same, but it's maintaining your vehicle. And most humans I find don't know how to maintain their vehicle from the nervous system reactions, the somatics, because it's just uncomfortable. I mean, it's really
mhm,
like we haven't been taught it. Men as a culture have been told it's a no-go zone to go into anything emotionally related. And so there's a lot of wounding that are just like under the surface, stuck in the center column. They're like kind of building up here. And so I see it kind of stacks on top of the diaphragm or under the diaphragm and it builds up into like here. So that's why we're stuck here because this is like, oh shit, if I get present for a moment, I got to feel all this stuff I haven't dealt with. So let me just stay focused, especially high achievers, those in high achieving professions, successful entrepreneurs, high stress careers. Like if I slow down for a moment, there's way too much. So let me just stay busy. I can hide behind all the success that I have. I can stay behind all my projects. But really, you're hiding from yourself and you're hiding from that well of emotions that if you did get present, it's here. And just one more analogy because it's coming through. Another visual, because the visuals I find for me have been so helpful to try to understand some of these like outside the box topics. But imagine if I say emotional capacity. So imagine you have a bucket and you have these big rocks in the bucket. And if I'm holding a career that I'm passionate about driving, if I'm handling a wife or a partner, if I'm handling kids, if I'm handling my body, I have all these big rocks. that require emotional capacity for me to continue to drive back to the vehicle, my engine at a high speed. So if those buckets are full emotionally, then one little thing on the top of it, I'm going to get dysregulated. I'm going to go to the back of my brain. I just don't have capacity. I blow my engine. So your ability to just regulate, the analogy I use is you keep removing the top rock off that bag of rocks, and that top rock just goes, oh, I got one other thing that hit. Wife came home and fucking attacked me. Ah, I have a little bit of bandwidth here to hold this, actually lead this conversation so it doesn't turn out. I'm going to handle that because I have a little bit of capacity to do it. Or don't feel like eating that actual meal plan I did or the diet. I'm going to order the food. I don't have capacity. I have a little bit more capacity to get up and handle that task. So when you get into
Mhm.
somatics, what you're actually doing is removing all the rocks or more of the rocks. So you develop much more actual capacity to take on a lot more of life because you're not
Mhm.
bogged down emotionally by all the past debris that's stuck in this center column here.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this. The analogy I look at, which is quite similar, it's like a kind of a pipe, and in this pipe there's all this coagulation. So to hear you speaking of the oil, it's like clearing out that pipe and like the old rusty places where water can't flow anymore. And then through, I look at emotions as this kind of flooding the body with this emotional energy is actually like flushing through this pipe so that life force and aliveness and all of that can actually begin to flow more. So I'm curious because it's something that I work a lot around with is sexuality and where sexuality meets emotionality in the nervous system. And I'd love to hear, I'm enjoying some of your analogies. So I'd love to hear some of how, especially for clients you're working with and individuals, we're often not conversations of sexuality, especially with men. I run pretty extensive deep dive men's retreats and containers, and I see men like so afraid to meet these like deep emotional wounding, and they're talking about the sexual wounding. It's like most of them won't never even touch that in their lifetime. So I'm curious from your side, like how you navigate into this conversation, especially with clients around this connection point between emotions and sexuality.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a lot of shame with men tied to sex, and it can be anything from sexual abuse to which a lot of men have. I found like in my retreats, I found it was much higher than I initially anticipated. I mean, I have my own, and I also found it seemed like 30-40% of men have some sort of sexual abuse, either by a man or a woman. And compare that when men get really vulnerable and start sharing some of their deeper wounding. There's wounding around performance. There's wounding around releasing too quickly, erectile dysfunction. There's all this wounding around the sexual, which to me, the bottom of that is inadequacy. And so I find we have these two primary wounds, recurring wounds that show up, which is either abandonment or inadequacy. And inadequacy to broaden that could be, I'm not good enough, I'm rejected, I'm not loved. At some level, we're going to be, if we're not loved, then we're going to be abandoned. And if we're abandoned, then we're not going to be loved. And so those two basic premises I find is when the wound happens in childhood. So we go through these worlds as emotionally free children, and we're free in the world. And then all of a sudden the wound happens, right? We get just enough old enough to actually recognize, oh, mom and dad, I'm needing something. They're not giving it to me. And then as little kids, we don't have the brains to go, mom and dad dysregulated. They have their own life and they love me, and I'm not getting my needs met. So we look around and go, I'm the only thing here. It must be my fault. So we often blame ourselves for why we didn't get our needs. And then that leads the trajectory of our ego or identity of we're trying to be enough in the world to fill that gap of feeling inadequate or not enough. So as an example, that fill that gap, you see a lot of high achievers that are very high achieving to feel enough. But if you're driven by the not enough wound, it's never going to be enough because there's always somebody bigger. There's always somebody that has more status or makes more money. And so it's this relentless hamster wheel of inadequacy. So I wanted to preface that first because when we now translate it to sex, if you haven't gone into your wound of inadequacy and learned to get comfortable there, like that's your actual source of power. Instead, we're avoiding it or unconscious to it or letting it drive us. We're essentially fighting this dragon within us. And this dragon is who we're constantly fighting, oftentimes with dad or, right? So we're fighting this external dragon that if we're finally enough, then we'll feel better. But it drives us and it's empty. So we just keep driving. Once we start to address and fight the dragon, you'll start to find that there's these deep wells of grief and there's these deep wells of shame and there's these deep wells underneath that inadequacy. And when we're able to get into the body and feel that, what it does is, the metaphor we use is, you go from fighting the dragon to riding the dragon, and it becomes your source of power. And so,
Mm.
two things I'll say to that. One, let's say I had an inadequacy. Let's say I haven't even dove in anything sexual. I find most men, because the inadequacy wound is so present, they either think they're God's gift to women, and they're like, I've made her come 7 times. I've done. They're saying these things, but if I'm attuned, I can't even feel. Half the time, their partners are just trying to make them feel better. Aren't actually.
Mhm.
They're not actually feeling their partner, actually really connecting with their partner. They're performing to feel adequate and highly attached to if their partner got pleasure from like the performer side, or something else is happening and they're just almost avoiding it. So they're not talking about sex, they're not talking about desires, they're not talking about anything, and so they don't learn anything, they don't get better, and because the inadequacy wound is driving it. So to kind of lead into that, one, if we're emotionally regulated, we can start to attune to ourselves, we can attune to our partner because we're present. You can feel the little subtleties of her nervous system, if she's contracting or expanding, to see what she likes or doesn't like. Secondly, you can see your own contractions and start to uncover your own pieces of, oh, I have performance anxiety, or I have to perform, or I have to be in control, or you can kind of uncover that. And I find beneath that, well, is there like deep vulnerability. And underneath that deep vulnerability, that's typically, I find, what your partner is deeply craving from you is your heart.
Mm.
And so if you can start to access that, that's the deep connection pieces, and allows us to be in a lot more attuned, connected, a lot more creative. Like I see a lot of men who have never, they're like, I dom my business, I dom this, but I've never dom my wife because my inadequacy of getting rejected, that unconscious fear of, if I do this and she doesn't like it, or when we met, she had somebody previously rape her. And so any little thing I did, she told me this was reminded it. So they went into nice guy in their relationship sexually. And so they've been fearful or afraid of being unloved or abandoned or rejected. So they don't even engage in the conversation versus getting really curious, asking a lot of questions, starting to be attuned, figuring out what creates safety. And so for me, there's kind of a couple components of nervous system attunement's the foundation. And then there's getting curious, asking questions, and creating enough safety to have needs, desires, boundaries, conversations. So if you know the boundaries, you can keep her safe. If you know needs and desires from both of you and what's comfortable, you can start to lead into there. And then there's a whole other world of like play that you can have, where you can have so much range of
Mm.
connection and expression once you know those things from each other. But it takes deep vulnerability. And you're going to have to go into the wound because most often, they haven't been sharing their actual truth because they've been fearful of rejection. And what you'll actually find is, when you can create safety to go there, there's deep intimacy, and
Mm.
there's such a deep connection that happens, and then you start to really get clear, and then you're able to start to move into it. So it's a super loaded question, because when you asked that, I initially went into like, so many guys have cock shame, they have inadequacy
Mm.
issues, they have perform, like there's so many things sexually, and that's all wound up down here below all of our trauma in the center column, underneath all the armor that our heads are in. So like, to get down to there, you almost have to do this long pathway of like moving through the traumatic debris, unpacking the armor, and going down to some of the deepest sources of pain for men, which is around the sexual
Mhm.
piece. Am I inadequate? Can I not please my partner? Can I not? And that feels frightening if you haven't done any of the top level work.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I love that, and the couple of the key pieces, and I love the places you're bringing in, because I just was this last week teaching a master class on embodied mastery in the bedroom and boardroom, and one of the big pieces is around like the deep listening and the attunement. And so to connect the dot to what you shared before with the slowing down to be patient with the body, is if the man can be patient with his own body, then he actually has the capacity to be patient and listen deeply to the body of another. But that, often gets overwhelmed by the high performance desire to try to give her something. And so even though they want to be this performer, they want to like, give her all the orgasms, but that desire almost is what is driving their nervous system to be dysregulated, because they think they're trying to get somewhere. And so really what I hear you sharing, and I love this, is the slowing down to listen more deeply and to be in the spaces in between rather than the paces that are always just trying to dom everything and to be with the uncomfortable edges inside.
When it's, yes, 100%. And I would also add one of the primary, because I just look at patterning and then I kind of build frameworks around the patterns, recurring patterns. And one of the consistent ones I see is men are often unconsciously looking for nurture, and
Mm,
women are often unconsciously looking for safety if it's in a masculine, man woman dynamic. But with that, when I've tracked it, this huge need of leaky energy, this energy around consumption, this energy at some level, I think we're just trying to get nurture. And it's what we've learned to get it. So, like, oh, if I can perform at a deep level, extract, I get these brief moments after that of feeling I can open up a little bit and be a little bit vulnerable or get a little bit of nurture. And it's because we haven't learned to nurture ourselves. And so we're
mhm,
looking for some external source to make us feel better. And if we get it, if I performed, I got a little bit of validation hit. If
mm,
I got a little bit of sexual energy, I got a little bit of this aliveness because I haven't learned how to access that in my own body. I haven't
mhm,
learned how to slow down, feel even my own body, feel the sensations and aliveness and pleasure in my body without getting it somewhere else. So we're often unconsciously stuck in codependent dynamics where it's a transaction where I'm going to give this to you, and then you're going to give me nurture. I'm going to give you safety, right? And so
mhm, mhm,
and so at some core level, I find as men, it's our job to learn how to nurture ourselves and to slow down
mhm,
and create aliveness in our body, which is present. It's just deep presence with the body. It's deep attunement with the body, deep pleasure within the body, and then we can now start to bridge that because we're present. And I find it's the flip side for women. It's actually learning to get safety in their bodies. It's learning to get safety with themselves in relation, so that we're more moving out of codependency into more independent. And
mhm,
it doesn't mean we can't still create it for each other, right? So I don't think that they're like separate. I just think that our own personal practices to both have containment and aliveness give us like such a powerful mixture to now actually meet somebody and go really deep, because I think people
mhm,
are craving depth and intimacy, and they're
mhm,
lacking it dramatically because there's a gap, there's a hole in their heart, and they're trying to fill the hole constantly with something that'll make them feel better. But we have to fill that up first with ourselves or with
mhm,
love or with, like, there's so many ways to fill it up. But it's that, back to what we said earlier, it's actually connecting with the body. So if we're living here and we're trying to fill it up from here, the body's like, I'm right here. Like I did a
ah,
all right, hey, no, just see me, just connect with me. I'm constantly with you. But there's a huge disconnect between our head and our body. So the more connected we get in the body, which we have to be present, and then we're going to have to deal with all the years of disconnection. And that's, I find, where the break is we just have decades that we haven't done it. We have decades of moving through the world, trying to feel enough, trying to gain significance, validation, something so that we're worthy in the world. So learning to flip it around and go, how do I see and love my body worthy exactly the way it is? Because the body's the
mhm,
teacher, is really the work. It's just
mm, mm.
it's just really hard and takes a lot of time and energy.
Yeah, it requires a certain level of commitment and willingness to dive in. When it comes to high performance, I see a lot of what, especially in the self development world, there's these high performance pieces that are very much trying to be ingrained and driven into the overachiever and getting things done and being in this constant level of doing. So I'd love to hear your perspectives. To me, the way I'll frame it is this line in this dance between the doing and the being, and especially for men, that we're looking for that, that nurture from the doingness. But how, without a man fully having a midlife breakdown, which unfortunately happened for a lot of men who are always just doing, then they have to literally slow down to put their feet in the sand. But what are some of the, you could say, the practical tools for especially a man to be able to have this deeper balance in his life so that he doesn't blow out his nervous system with the doingness that wants to be the provider, that wants to make the money, that wants to meet the goals, that wants to be the achiever, and the beingness which doesn't always have the same level of happy chemicals that we think are coming with that. So where Like, what are some of the tools you feel like people should utilize to have a healthier balance between the doing and the being?
Yeah, and I love how you frame that. It's another way to say what I said earlier is the nurture is the being.
Mm,
And
mm,
so same frame of doing, I'm out in the world busy doing, achieving. Being is I'm just being present. I'm learning to nurture myself and create more aliveness. So um, really it's the same fundamentals we've been talking about, but I'm happy to give a couple examples. So one, if we're not regulating daily, we're not even present to see where we're at. And so you know what? I think I'll lead with a story around this because I think that'll help kind of ground it in, like a high achiever, where they were before putting the tools in place, and then how they saw the world differently and how that showed
mm,
differently. And then from that place, they can start to see the difference. And then what are the actual tools they use? But I think the story will help it land a little easier.
mm,
So I had a client that a very high achiever that was achieving well, kiddo, wife, took care of his body in a great shape, very high achiever, very like what you'd call a personality that was handling things, but was like, I noticed there's some blowouts happening with my wife. That was kind of the leverage of like, I'd like to live a better life, yet I still have goals to keep growing in my business. And when we started doing the work, he started regulating every day. And so we'll get to that in just a moment, but he started regulating twice a day. So he started catching himself. So he started saying, like, oh, wait, when I'm in high drive, overdrive without regulation, I just blow through things as they come up. I'm not using the front of my brain, which is rational thinking, compassion, empathy. I'm in the back of my brain, which is get the job done. As soon as they come up, push the task out of the way and go. But when he started regulating every day, he was able to self assess and go, oh, you know what? When I have the most emotional capacity, I'm going to do the hardest projects because I'm faster at them. And if something comes in outside of that window, I'm going to move it to another part of where I am resourced. So what he found is like, oh, if I finish the end of my day and some stressful thing comes in and I go handle it at the very end of my day, that bleeds over into my evening and I'm bringing that stress into my environment and I'm becoming the villain, and it's actually attacking my primary goal, which is to have this amazing household and a deep connection with my wife and a really good connection with my son. And so what he started finding is, wait a second, if that comes in at the end of the day, I value this so highly, I can actually just bump it to first thing in the morning. And so that I'm regulated to actually really do what matters most, to spend that quality time. Because he noticed if I'm present with them and we're really good, like I feel better and I actually have more capacity to handle those other tasks. So that was like one big shift that happened. Also, because he's thinking differently, he's much more present and he started to value the time with family. So previously, he was working all the time, little bits of time with family, but the more present he got, the more he started to uncover. And we did a lot of work going into the wounding, figuring out what some of these habitual patterns were, some of the somatics to move that through his body. He cleaned up more capacity and then it flipped. Then it flipped where he's like, oh man, I want to spend all my time with my family as much as I can doing things that matter most. Like, what's the juice of life? I want to be spending time with my son doing quality things. I want to be spending cool trips and cool things with my wife. Even just really being present at night with my family is so valuable for me. So then how do I find ways to shorten the amount of time I'm working and get really creative? And so he ended up finding a way to double his business and extend the time with his family because it just flipped his priority. So the way he was thinking wasn't just make more with my limited time. It was more like, how do I keep growing the time with my family and creatively think of ways to leverage and scale my business? And so it flipped. And so I just want to
mhm,
give a couple examples where I often see the same pattern is you're able to scale your business, spend more time with your family, take better care of your health when you get regulated and when you start to move through some of that past debris, because you start to
mm,
live a thriving life. It's almost like imagine you've been eating, or actually I'll use a different metaphor. Imagine I work with a lot of high achievers that have financial freedom. When you're first starting and you don't have a lot of money, you're in survival. So when you're in survival, like you just have to grind, you have to get it done. But as you start to accumulate more wealth, to reach the point where you're like, I got my nest egg, I can live, my savings pays for my bills for the rest of my life. You're actually financially free. There's this relief that comes like I can kind of do what I want, and that financial freedom gives you so much access. Think of the same way we're doing emotionally. I find most people are starved emotionally. It's like they've been eating Taco Bell, so they don't even have a perspective of what a thriving emotional life looks like because they've been living a survival life. And then you go to like a really nice fine dining dinner and you taste all the food. You're like, I want that. It's what's been happening. We just we've been living an emotionally survival life since childhood. And when you can start to experience that, the game changes. So a couple key pieces, just active tools. One is the primary tool I teach is just daily emotion regulation through breath. And it's just a real basic, I call it CPR breath work, but it's 4-6 breathing. So it's just an in breath of 4 and an out breath of 6. Sounds really basic, but the exhale is when you're actually turning on your nervous system or your vagus nerve. And the key is you have to do that for a minimum of 6 minutes. So the protocol I use is you're doing that twice a day for 6 minutes, and you build that into your ritual, meaning you can do it while you're doing other tasks, but you don't miss. And then in addition, when you notice any form of dysregulation, either from you or somebody, your team, your spouse, your kiddos, you also then use CPR, where you take a moment to pause, get regulated, so you can then navigate that. There's a couple other primary ways of cold immersion, physical contact to co-regulate with animals, massages, even with your partner, if you guys both get first in this practice. Exercise, vocal sounds. That's why I like chanting, or even when you get into somatics, making noises really get you back into regulation. Or the primary, I teach 5 primary ways of it. And that's kind of like the first pillar. Second pillar is really moving into the somatic. So it's learning to go, okay, if I'm regulating every day, then you start to notice the subtle things that you are reacting to. And then you use CPR, you become aware of those, you pause, and then you start to go into those actual emotional reactions somatically and start to feel what's actually going on with you through anger practices, somatic grief practices, movement practices, sound practices. And what they do is they give it a voice, it gets you in the body. And then from that place, you start to actually move that energy, and you actually get to your actual needs and boundaries. And so you're able to start engaging with the world, because now you can feel what you need. You can feel a need, you can feel a boundary, you can feel a desire from your heart's desire. Or another common thing is a lot of men will realize they've been wearing masks everywhere in the world, and they haven't been authentic. And then you start to break that down and go, oh, I'm wearing a mask here. Pause, regulate, what's underneath that? Oh, and then you can start to get, what's my authentic core? And how do I start to make that the primary place that I'm living? Because again, going back to the inadequacy wound, we were brilliant as kids, and we learned to survive childhood. And so if you have a chameleon side or a nice guy side or even a savage man side, they're just parts that have come online to protect us from being and that's our survival mechanism. So when we start to uncover those and access our true self and make that actually lead and get confident in that, that's when the game changes, because we put needs and boundaries around the things that don't work. We were able to communicate with a lot more love, and then we have a lot more compassion for other people's needs and boundaries because we have them. So we highly start to value, like, oh, this is how you get closer to me. Let me teach you how to love me and teach me how to love you. And so it provides a lot more deep intimacy. And in team environments, just to give one more example of this for high performance, so many times we're cracking the whip to like get results. It's like, here's the top line revenue, here's the bottom line revenue, and we're like using force and like higher and higher work. And people are so dysregulated now. They're like, we got dopamine addictions where people are stuck on their phone all the time. We got high stress. Like life is like so much work, and people are dysregulated. When you actually start to realize that, and you start to build cultures where people start to regulate their emotions, even doing conflict with each other, the whole game starts to change because they get present, they become more alive, they get higher productivity, you reduce turnover, like you really build the culture of an organization where the organization drives for you versus you cracking whips. You actually increase, I think the recent study I looked at was like you increase productivity by 19% just by actually putting these systems in place. Because if I'm alive in my body and I like what I'm doing and I'm productive, I'm going to get a lot more done than if I'm sitting there like exhausted, like I got to get the task done and I've looked at it 20 times and it took me twice or 3 times as long because I was dysregulated, versus, you know what, I'm chopping down a tree with this axe and I've been using the same axe. Let me go take a couple minutes to sharpen the axe and then like take my time in cutting down the trees versus working harder and harder and harder. So that's just an easy analogy. Think of emotional regulation as sharpening your axe every time you notice it gets dull for productivity.
Love that. Yeah, and the place of where that can translate into the business world and our capacity to take care of ourselves and still be productive and not need to burn ourselves out. I mean, I feel like burnout is such a high alive topic and conversation, and really what I'm hearing you share is that through this there's a lot less propensity for that and more of a capacity to listen more deeply. It's beautiful. I'd love to transition into, I saw that your documentary that you created is coming out soon, and it's called The Gifts of Grief. And it's quite a personal. I mean, I haven't seen it. I'm excited to check it out. I think I remember you speaking about it a while back. So I'd love to just hear, like, maybe obviously some of the inspiration, like the big why, and just some of the excitement around it, and what's alive for you with that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited. It's been a 10-year journey. So I've been documenting my journey for a decade. And it originated after the loss of my brother. My brother came to me for help in 2007 and said, I've been shooting needles. I got to come live with you. I've been shooting heroin. I told him no, because I had a startup company and I couldn't take care of him. And he went back to Reno 2 days later and died of a drug overdose. And that really put me on this trajectory of grief and loss. But at the time, um, I went to go work with Tony Robbins. And that's how I initially dealt with it and learned all the NLP mindset tools, peak performance tools, because that was my old way of being. I wanted to achieve and I wanted to succeed because of my own inadequacy wound. And I thought I fixed it. I used all the tools. I would change my state when I didn't feel good. I would change the meaning of the story that I was creating. Like, I would use the tools, thought I had achieved it. What I didn't know, I was just an empty shell that was moving through the world, but I'm totally emotionally disconnected. Um, and then I started the film to go, well, actually, I got on grief forums because I think our purpose keeps showing up. And one of my deep purposes has been helping people around grief and loss. And I got on grief forums and I'm like, all right, let's actually fully go into this. When I left Tony, and I got all these tools, I'm going to help everybody. I started grabbing people to help, and then just failed miserably. And I was like, I thought I knew what I was doing. Like, I just worked with the best in the world, and what am I doing? And then I started researching grief and loss, and started interviewing some of the experts, trying to help people on grief forums because I was fixed. And how do I help fix their grief? And what I learned really quickly is like, oh, I was the one that had dealt with my grief. And it led me from some frameworks to understand it deeper, and learning to like allow myself to be okay with grief and loss. Because some of the deepest work I've learned about grief is it's not about fixing it or getting better or getting over it. It's about learning to love those parts of you and like create space in your heart to be with the grief. And some of it may never go away over the course of a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And to become
Mm-hmm.
really compassionate and gentle with that. And then that's when I started learning about the somatics to get in and feel and be with the grief and be with the anger. And it actually brought me into my heart. All the things I was searching for externally, when I went inward, I started to feel the things that I'd been craving through my external achievements, but never, like you said, an achievement, you get to the top and then you're like, what's the next thing? Like, it's not really satiating. And then by going
Mm-hmm.
in, I got into these states of like, oh, I'm just seeing, like, talk about being. I was like, oh, I'm seeing the world. I'm seeing aliveness. I'm like, I came back to life again. And so that's what inspired me to go into men's work and spent the last decade in men's work, helping men reframe grief and loss and using somatics to get in the body to offload that, which then led into first responders, training fire, police, and military. And so the story documents that process over a decade. So you see me going through that process when I'm in my head. You see me learning some of the somatics and how I literally shift over the course of a decade. And then it has men's work, and showing that in men's work, it shows it in first responder work, and then really showcasing my family, because my mom hadn't touched my brother's room in a decade. And so showing her journey and my dad's journey. And so it just shows like, so for me, the kind of the central theme about the film is like, grief is a natural response to loss. And the only way out is through it, and it's through grief. So it's
Mm-hmm.
more, more of a case for a more grief informed world, where trauma informed has now become this big kind of buzzword. Are you trauma informed? And I'd really like that to happen around grief, because to me that's the central theme that I see. And so it's taken a decade. It's a long journey of like getting it to where it's at, but I self-funded it. I just kept recording, and then I went through my own deep forgiveness process at the men's community I built. Some of the guys held a retreat, some of the guys coming up, and I went to support, and they ran a forgiveness process. And I actually got to some deeper grief after teaching a decade of forgiveness. I got to these deeper layers of recognizing I'd blame myself. And in that moment, it shifted me, and like it moved to like completion. And so I was like, oh, now it's about putting this into the world. And so now it's art. Now it's art that I'm using to really just bring more awareness to people. I think if they, through the story format that I go through, I think they'll see their own story of where they may still have unprocessed grief and be able to a stronger case to find different people that, and I have a ton of resources for people to go to. And here, hey, find your jam, find what works for you, find a place that feels safe to go to do that. So it's really um, the mission. So I'm going to be essentially promoting the launch for the month of November, and then on my brother's birthday, December 6th through December 12th, I'm going to release it where we can do an online film premiere and people can watch it from everywhere and just put it into the world. I've won a couple awards and been in 7 film festivals and won a couple of best features. So it's cool, man. It's a cool kind of creative project. But I'm just happy to like have this in the world. Will be when it finishes this year, will be 11 years.
Wow.
Be like,
when did you finish the documentary?
I finished it end of last year.
Okay.
And, got it down to a 60-minute film, and so taking like 14 terabytes of footage and then turning that into a 60-minute story was a lot of work. And so I initially just shelved it, like, all right, whenever this is supposed to come, it'll come. And then I got an inspiration to be like, oh, I'm ready to put this into the world on my brother's birthday. And also launched like a 1-day summit just to provide support for those that the holidays can be really tough going through loss. And I think what people are listening to this, they often think grief and loss with like the death of somebody. But the reason I say it's the central theme of my work, I find there's so many losses, and the losses are actually what's affecting us every day that we don't realize are losses. And the tricky ones, the easy ones, are like the death of a loved one. Like, oh, I know somebody died and why I'm experiencing grief, or my cat died, or and then you broaden the more direct ones. I lost some money in an investment, or I lost my job, or something very physical loss. I lost a limb. I lost something, lost a relationship, a breakup, divorce. But the deeper ones, not more depth of pain, but the trickier ones to identify are like, oh, I'm grieving way back in childhood, the dream of my parents being together and then they got divorced, or I fell in love with men are safe in the world and then I got violated, and then I have heartbreak around I can't trust men, or mom is going to be my nurturer and then she smothers me or avoids me, and I got heartbroken around mom, or our body as we change. Oh, I used to be this young fit guy that could eat whatever I wanted and snap back, and now my body's slowing down, or I'm aging, so I'm actually grieving my youth. Or I have a dream of being a family and being in partnership and having kiddos, and I'm past the age I dreamed that vision, and so now I'm in grief. And so there's all these tricky ways that grief is actually in our body that we don't relate to as grief. And when we can learn to identify those and feel those and grieve the vision we had that we fell in love with that didn't come true, or learn to grieve a loved one or a previous relationship and create space in our heart for that, that actually allows us to get present again, back to the beingness. We actually feel the heartbreak, we get really present, and then we can create the new vision. And that's when it's like, oh, but I still got this life. What's the vision for me now? But if I'm have unprocessed grief that I haven't addressed, then I'm on the hamster wheel trying to, like, I'm behind, I got to get it done. And so we're just stuck in this reoccurring pattern of resisting change. So the easiest kind of framing is, change is the one thing that's consistent in life. When you learn to get really good at grief work, you learn to move through change very quickly, which is back to the emotional resilience piece. It's like, oh, I can sense when something's coming and I can move through the death and rebirth cycle. And grief is the primary tool because we come in with it. Like, you think about, how do we come into this world? We're in this womb where all of our needs are taken care of. We fall in love with, I just float around in a nice little sack and I get fed and I get relaxed and it's nice and warm. And then we lose that world and we that dies and we come into this world. And how do we come in? Do we come in laughing and celebrating and excited? No, we come in grieving. And so if we literally enter this world grieving, shouldn't that be the fundamental tool or emotion that we learn to move through change, which is going to be the primary thing that's constant? So I think when we can really understand that and learn to practice it and be together in community and be witnessed in it, that's where lots of the deep healing takes place.
Yeah, this principle of change and the change of form, and the place of matter. It's just changing form, and matter can't be created nor destroyed. It's just changing form. And I guess a question I have for that with you, in this initial loss of your brother and what it set you on in this decade journey, Like, have there been times when you've felt his energy there with you in the creation of this, and you want to speak into that? Because this is sometimes where it's like we're playing in this kind of space-time continuum of what gets created through the change through our lives and utilizing the tool of grief. But I'd love to hear any thoughts on that.
Yeah, one of the traditional concept around men's work and the hero's journey is the cracks, if you will, the dark cave, when you resist going into the dark cave, but when you can go into the dark cave, and find what that is, it ends up being the gift that you bring to the world. And so
Mm,
I can see very clearly from like a spiritual side, that huge traumatic incident of grief led me to doing this work, and now it's the primary central theme of what I give to the world. So I've been able to turn that pain into my gift, and he's just as much in it as I am.
mhm,
And so he's very much a part of the gift that I give and the co-creation of that. And I still had to go through so much grief, and it wasn't until I just learned to accept this may be here forever,
mm,
and really keep allowing the layers of that is what actually brought me grace. Because I mean, up until more recently, and it's been 15 years now, um, about I guess 2007, so 27, like just under 20 years.
yeah.
Um, and I still the holidays would be miserable, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and I'd always judge it for many years until I learned to be
Mhm,
more graceful and accepting of like, okay, this is just I have some sadness that comes up, and how can I learn to miss it
mm,
and love
mhm,
it? It definitely helped because I ran we did a ton of things. I did a Burning Man camp with my parents dedicated to him, and it was called the Wonders Camp, which is my brother's name. So we did tons of celebration. I interview psychics, and that's part of the film because we would look for the signs that my brother was still around, and that was really a big part of our story, which gave us some like grace in the pain.
mm, mhm,
Oh, I can still communicate with him. He is still here. I can look for his presence and all the ways his presence is here, or carry his presence through my heart.
mm,
I think one of the greatest gifts is if we can still carry their legacy on by our love for them. And so
mm,
when we're able to be in the grief and celebrate them and continually talk about them and continually bring their love in, they're still alive. I think one of the greatest examples of this is like if I look at Jesus Christ, right? Like here's an example of somebody there's so much love for in the world, and so many people have brought him into his hearts that a lot of because I'm just now learning that path. I'm like just new, kind of going down my own investigation, but I'm like, oh, so many people across the world are loving him and keeping his love alive, that they call him like living, like this living well to bring from. And so I see it through that lens of love. I'm like,
mm,
oh, there's so much love in the world that they're keeping his love and his spirit and his story alive, but they're filled up from that love. And I really think that that's like an extreme case of it, but I think it can happen on an individual level with a cat that dies, a dog that dies, somebody we love, a dream that dies. It's like, how do we turn that into something new that we plant, and that starts to grow, that we can continually re-experience love from?
mhm, mhm. Yeah, it's a beautiful framing around the form in which love exists, and how it's the acceptance of what is really, and one of the moments I could really feel you there was that place of actually accepting and finding not only the self-love but really the self-forgiveness in that. And I also just want to appreciate what I heard you share is going back and actually the community that you started, going back and being a student of your own students in a way. And something that I really kind of pride myself in as well in the space. Like, I always commit at least once or twice a year to go and be a student. And I'm teaching so many trainings and retreats and groups and things, and like the learnings that come from that, and the deep place, the humility that arise when you can do your own work and really show up in that way. And it's one of the things I really appreciate you. I mean, we've known each other on and off for years, but I really appreciate that I can sense in what you're sharing around the nervous system and around the grief and all of that, that this is really like the tools you've learned how to deal with and to move with and to find love, acceptance, and appreciation for this life's journey. And a result of that, teach and support others. So yeah, just an acknowledgement in that journey of who you are, brother. It's beautiful.
Thank you, brother. Yeah, and I find the same with you. I find that's who I most align with now. There's so many coaches and teachers in our community, in our space, and I find therapists, right? And I find like the difference between the quality ones and the rest, which is a lot of the rest, is the ones that continually do the work, right? It's like
Mhm.
continually are the more you know nothing. And so it's like you continually just try to get better and
Hmm.
keep learning and keep being a student. And I think it like you keep learning more tools and it keeps broadening your mindset and it keeps having you understand concepts at a deeper level. When you see it through a different lens, you're like, oh, okay, I know this or I teach it, but I'm going to go do another one. And then you're like, oh, that one thing they taught, wow, just looking at it from this way, like, or it shows you where you've been out of integrity with something, or you've like, oh, I taught that in the beginning, but I got so caught up in this, I haven't done these fundamentals. So it's like, I think that's the difference between somebody who is like high value or integrated is somebody who's committed to continually doing the work because
Hmm.
you continually are a student. And so you're continually humbled. Right? You
Hmm.
continue like,
Hmm.
all right, I know nothing. Let me keep coming.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate that about you as well.
And so this you have a big release in December with this documentary. Anything else fun, exciting that's really like inspiring to you that's coming out in the next, couple months, or what else is alive for you that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'll give a little pre-framing around it, but I'm now doing women's work, and I have a program called the Sovereign Woman, which I'm really excited about, and it birthed just from I used to believe men do men, women do women, and I was pretty rigid in that for a long time, over a decade, and then I started to see that one, the men I was training them, usually it's flipped, women bring the emotional to the men, but I started to train the men because they were getting trained emotionally. They were starting to bring that to their relationships and being like, oh, I have all these tools. My woman can't meet me. Can we do some coaching? And I started to do couples coaching. And I noticed the women are just way more advanced than us emotionally. And so they would pick it up faster and they would actually be able to lead the relationship better emotionally when they had the tools. That was kind of my first inclination of watching that process happen. And then my own personal journey the last 5 years in working with women. I worked with men for so long and did a lot of work on father wound. I did a lot of work on my own wounding and getting really complete. But I found men could only go so far in helping me in my own relationship paths. And I got really curious about women. And that's been really what's helped me the most the last 5 years is hearing like really integrated women giving me feedback, feeling how they feel. Like so many little intricacies of that has really been like allowed me to level up and see the world very differently and women very differently. And so I think with the rise of the Me Too movement and just rightfully so because we needed some accountability of what men have done in our culture and that's also created like these recurring movements where there's still a lot of anger out there
Mm.
and I also see now men's groups forming like the red pill movement to counter that and I just keep seeing things and it feels like there's a deep need for men to hold a safe container for women to heal the wounding around the masculine. So I have a program called the Sovereign Woman for women wanting a relationship with a high value man. And there's a couple different phases. So I have a phase where they're working on the same fundamental tools we've been talking with here, where they're learning to regulate their nervous systems. We're doing somatics to get in and take ownership for the body and really learning how to identify the difference between a high value man who's integrated and a man who isn't. Because most of the time I find it's not being able to identify the difference is where
Hmm.
they start out in the wrong dynamics. Or once they have the tools, there's another program where it's like, how do you really focus on dating? Where you get really good feedback by a group of women who are using the fundamental tools to say, hey, are you regulated? What's going on in your body? And so they can get women into their hearts to really start to self-assess what's going on and provide safe reflections and community who are also doing the work. Because so oftentimes people are like throwing trauma wounds or projections or their own fears and inadequacies on others. And then that's leading to this debris. And I really believe if we heal the relationship with our heart, then we can start to have healthier relationships in a partnership. And if we have a healthy partnership, we can really create healthy family units. And I believe if
Hmm.
we do that, I really believe that changes the trajectory of the world. And so I did men for a decade. Now I'm jumping into women and I'm really, really passionate. So I have that Sovereign Woman program that I'm super passionate about as well.
Oh, I love that. Love that. Actually, last time I was in Austin, I was running a weekend called The Art of Loving Men, which is a
Mm,
workshop for women about how to, move through all of their challenges and their grief and their difficulties, and then get to know their own inner man and kind of build in that inner marriage more, which is kind of the thread that I often drive with. So I love that you're kind of supporting the women in that way too. It's beautiful.
thank you, Noah.
Yeah, amazing, man. Well, I really appreciate you. I honor what you bring into the world. I love that this documentary is impacting a lot of people's lives, and I'm looking forward to checking it out myself coming up. And yeah, just thank you for your presence. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your commitment to being a beneficial presence on this planet. It's really a joy to witness and to experience you in this way.
Thank you so much, brother. Yeah, it's been an honor. Thanks for having me on, and always good to connect with you, bro.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. And check in for the next time with love, sex, and leadership. See you next time. Ciao.